Hello, everyone. We'll just wait another minute until everyone's on to get started. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Roshanak Medipana, and I'm the Director of Housing Solutions for Health Equity Initiative, housed in the School of Public Health. Thank you for joining us for our Housing Solutions Speaker Series, where we highlight housing research and its connections to health and health equity. For those who are unfamiliar with what we do, the Housing Solutions for Health Equity Initiative informs local, state, and national policy through interdisciplinary research on housing as it relates to equity in health, race, socioeconomic status, and aging. Housing Solutions prioritizes engaging in research that addresses housing and health equity because we believe access to adequate housing is a human right. Now, before I introduce the speakers, I would also like to thank our staff working behind the scenes today, Malika Belhaj, who has brought all of us together here today, and Caitlin Lynch, who's assisting us today, ensuring that everything goes smoothly. So today, our speakers will focus on the impact of eviction filing on tenant households in Pennsylvania. researchers will present key findings from their recent report, Record Costs, which documents the profound and lasting consequences of eviction filing for the well-being and stability of poor and working class tenants. They will be joined by Pennsylvania State Representative Izzy Smith-Waddell, who will discuss the implications of this research for their work in legal aid and legislative action. Throughout the event, feel free to submit your questions to the Zoom's Q&A, and we hope to answer them during our Q&A session at the end. I will also encourage you to use your side-by-side speaker settings for Zoom to see and hear our speakers today. So, first I have the pleasure of introducing Holly Beck, who will moderate the event. Holly Beck is a Divisional Supervising Attorney in the Housing Unit at Community Legal Services, where she focuses on providing advice and representation to tenants facing eviction and other forms of housing instability. She also leads the Housing Unit's work on the inequitable impacts of eviction records and tenant screening practices. Before joining CLS, Holly represented low-income parents involved in New York City's child welfare system, first as an attorney at Bronx Defenders, and then as a supervising attorney at Neighborhood Defender Services of Harlem. Holly also served as legislative counsel at the New York City Council, where she drafted legislation and advised elected officials. Holly received her JD from New York University Law and her BA with honors from McGill University. Happy to have you here, Holly, today. I'll hand it over to you.
So much, Roshanak, and I'm delighted to be here with you all. The issue of eviction records is something that we at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia encounter every single day. So my colleagues and I represent tenants facing eviction, and even when people are dealing with that turmoil of facing possible eviction and that housing instability, the single most common question we get is still, will this case be on my record? And unfortunately, the answer is yes for every tenant we represent, because the record is created the minute the landlord files the eviction case. And As of right now, Pennsylvania has no mechanism yet to seal or expunge any of the hundreds of thousands of eviction cases that are publicly viewable on the internet. And so when we at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia got the chance to partner with the wonderful team at the University of Michigan School of Public Health to document what that eviction record truly does to a person, we jumped at it. And the research that these folks put out is so comprehensive, so exquisitely detailed, and deeply compelling. They've hit on the human impact of an eviction record, and I'm so excited to introduce them so you can hear from them. First, we have Lex Eisenberg, PhD and Master's in Public Health, an educator, researcher, and organizer based in Detroit, whose work seeks to build the evidence base for movements and policy change that can support the rights and livelihoods of tenants. They are a lecturer in the School of Public Health, a faculty affiliate with Poverty Solutions, and a collaborator with the Housing Solutions for Health Equity Initiative at the University of Michigan. And Kate Brantley, MSW, is a social worker by training and a researcher at Housing Solutions for Health Equity at the University of Michigan. Their work focuses on eviction injustice, the consequences of forced displacement for mental health and community well-being, and structural change that affirms housing as a human right. I will hand it over now to Lex and Kate.
Whew, thank you so much for that introduction, Holly. So I'm going to share my screen, hopefully successfully. Are you able to see the screen right now? Okay, great. I can't, which is an interesting problem. 1 second as I try to figure that out. A minute ago. Okay, so you can see the slides now. Can you unmute and tell me? No. Okay.
I think they're loading.
Fortunate. Okay. All right. They're still loading.
Yeah, give it 1 second. Lex, would you like me to share my screen and you can just tell me when to click?
Let's just try one more thing. Sorry. No luck still? Gosh, that is a bummer. Okay, we'll have to do that, I guess. Kate, thanks. I'll just say click, I guess. Okay, will you press the slideshow? Thanks. All right, so, here we are on Zoom. Thank you so much, Holly, for the introduction and for everyone's patience. I'm really grateful to be in discussion with you all. Again, I'm Lex, and I really just relish the opportunity to build awareness and analysis of the eviction crisis, not simply for the sake of creating knowledge, but with the clear-eyed goal of enacting policy change that can mitigate the severe, lasting, and really needless harms of eviction. Ultimately, so we can get towards a world where tenants and all people have access to safe and stable housing. I want to thank the people who have made this research possible. Holly, first off, you and your team at Community Legal Services have been instrumental collaborators throughout. You're tireless advocates for your clients from the courtroom to the legislature, and that takes a ton of energy and also a diversity of tactics, including research. And so it's really good to be in the fight with you. Of course, want to thank Housing Solutions for Health Equity for their support throughout this entire research process. Of course, my former advisor and forever mentor, Dr. Roshana Medifana, who is also a co-PI in this work. An enormous thank you to my friend and co-investigator, Kate Brantley, for their thought partnership and meticulous stewardship of this project. And finally, I want to extend my deep gratitude for the participants who generously shared their stories with us. This necessarily involved retelling stories of landlord exploitation, dispossession, and the lasting and multi-dimensional fallout of eviction. And it's important to acknowledge that everyone who participated in our study not only did not simply undergo eviction, they stood up, they fought back, they resisted, and then they told their stories. And many of them did so with the explicit intention of making this their circumstances of this situation different, not just for themselves, but for other people. And so I want to really hold that intention with us today. Next slide. So I'm going to start by providing some context to ground our study. Click. It's not news probably to anyone here that rising rents and stagnant wages have turned eviction into a routine process for poor and working class renters. Evictions impact millions of households each year in the United States. And so for a window into the scale of the housing crisis in Pennsylvania, a resident who's working a minimum wage job would need to work the equivalent of 130 hours a week, that's 3.3 full-time jobs, just to afford the average cost of a two-bedroom rental in Pennsylvania. And while evictions have declined significantly due to pandemic-era programs, you can click, filing rates in Pennsylvania have shot up to pre-pandemic levels. So in 2023, landlords filed more than 114,000 cases against Pennsylvania tenants. This means that the equivalent of 7 in every 100 renter households was brought to court for an eviction every year. Next slide. So when most people think of eviction, they'll often think of a person, a family, a child being displaced. And this is the most severe, this is the most traumatic outcome of eviction. And we need to be thinking about this. We need to prioritize policy that will stop displacement and keep families in their homes. However, in order to understand the full scope and consequences of eviction in the US, it's necessary for us to consider eviction not just an outcome or a discrete event of displacement, but rather a social and legal process, involving multiple stages and possible outcomes. And it's often cyclical. Next slide. So often in this study, we focus not on the end stage of eviction, but actually the first step in the legal eviction process. When landlords file an eviction complaint against a tenant in court, which we'll refer to as the eviction filing. So once a case is filed, there's a number of different ways it can go. So in a typical eviction case ending in displacement, the court will often issue a judgment in favor of a landlord and against a tenant. And they may even authorize a court officer to forcibly remove a tenant and their family from a home. We know that this has devastating social, economic, health impacts for families and also entire communities who are impacted by eviction. And we also know that the eviction process is structurally biased against tenants. And one reason for this, among many, is that tenants have no right to legal counsel in most jurisdictions in eviction court. And so this means they're forced to navigate an unjust and demoralizing court process for the most part on their own. Next slide. But a key question in this research is, what are the impacts of eviction for tenants who don't face this court-ordered displacement? What about those who attain what we might think of as the best case scenario in eviction court? For instance, what happens if a tenant has their case dismissed or it's settled before a judgment? What about people who have legal representation like Holly? What are the impacts of eviction for people who win their cases? And so we're interested in this group of tenants for several reasons. So for one, their experience can help illuminate the full scale of harm caused by eviction. Current and most prominent strategies for preventing eviction place a heavy emphasis on interventions that take place within the courtroom and which aim to reduce disruptive displacement. And again, while these policies are essential, sometimes the narrative around them can create a false binary where tenants who receive help or who get their case dismissed are presumed maybe to not be forcibly displaced or to have costs that are less to them or less significant to society. But research indicates that landlords increasingly are using the court system not only to remove tenants from homes, but to collect debts and to assert their power and control over tenants, causing harm and displacement even when the court record might not show it. And then beyond this, tenants in the best case scenario can help, go back a little bit, help us understand the potential harm and disruption caused by eviction filings on their own, which research hasn't really examined. And so just to explain, when a landlord files an eviction complaint against a tenant, the court will generate a public record that goes along with it. And as Holly described in the beginning, in Pennsylvania, as in many jurisdictions, most, there's where there aren't eviction sealing laws on the books. These records remain public and accessible online indefinitely. So this means even when the records are incomplete or inaccurate, even when they're filed in error or without a specific legal cause, or even when the case is not argued before a judge or when a tenant wins in court. And this is a problem, as you might guess, because for a lot of reasons, but particularly because research is showing in the digital age that landlords increasingly rely on third-party tenant screening companies, algorithms and reports generated by those companies, or a simple internet search to screen potential tenants and then apply blanket denials of applicants with any eviction on their record, regardless of their case's outcome. And this means that tenants with eviction filings on their records can find themselves essentially blacklisted from the housing market due to the stain, or what's been called the Scarlet E, on their records, what legal scholars sometimes call invisible punishments, or what Caitlin Polk has deemed the collateral consequences of eviction. And so this is where our research comes in, trying to take a closer look at these costs of eviction filings. So thanks for running the slides, Kate. I'll kick it to you.
Wow, we are having a Zoom morning this morning. So thank you so much, Lex and Holly, for the introductions and for your partnership in this work. Before we dig into some key findings from this project, I'll briefly describe the methods used for this research and share some basic information about our sample. So in this study, we utilized concept mapping and survey methods to examine the impact of eviction filings on tenant households. Concept mapping is a participatory method that involves collecting qualitative data. In our case, we did this using a series of focus groups, and then analyzing that data quantitatively and presenting it visually. And so this method allows us to engage participants in generating, structuring, and making meaning of the data. And so these concept mapping sessions centered on this key focus question that I have here on the slide. Since your landlord filed an eviction case against you in court, what have been some of the costs or losses impacting you or your household's well-being? And so we define well-being broadly to include any disruption of social, financial, job-related, housing-related disruptions to folks' lives. And after these concept mapping sessions, we also engaged participants in phone surveys where we collected additional information to learn more about their eviction filing experience, as well as the implications of that filing for their short and long-term housing stability. And so our sample included 29 participants. The majority of these were women of color, many of whom were mothers. And again, all of these participants had received legal assistance. So they received assistance from one of 5 Pennsylvania legal aid organizations, including Community Legal Services, where Holly works. And all of them had had this case filed against them in the past 5 years and had their cases resolved with what we consider a neutral or a favorable outcome. So the case was either dismissed by the court, withdrawn by their landlord, or won. And again, this is the best case scenario in eviction court. None of them had an eviction judgment entered against them or a court-ordered eviction. And so I'll note that throughout this presentation today, we'll be highlighting a few different vignettes, and these vignettes represent eviction filing experiences of individual participants, but we're careful to use pseudonyms to protect their privacy. And I'll kick it back to Lex.
Thank you. So the first major finding of our research is that eviction filings, even though tenants' cases were resolved with a neutral or favorable outcome, still had really far-reaching collateral costs that negatively impacted the quality and trajectory of their lives. So we visualize this in our concept maps. So like Kate said during the sessions, participants generated statements about the costs and losses that they experienced due to their eviction filing, and they generated 55 unique statements then that they then grouped into 5 thematic clusters that show up here. So without going into too much detail on sort of how we did this, but the main takeaway is that tenants described kind of 5 key areas where they were most impacted by their eviction filings. So they said that it threatened their immediate and long-term housing stability. And they also talked about it contributing to income loss and job insecurity, caused harms to their physical and mental health, and also strained relationships with their family and friends. So there's a lot more we could say here. Check out the report for fuller details. But for the next finding, what we learned was, again, despite the fact that participants were not formally evicted by the court, their landlords still had the power to displace them. So by the time we spoke to tenants, about 2/3 had moved out of the property that they had faced an eviction filing at. And when we asked them, the majority said that they were forced to move, and for reasons that were beyond their control. And most attributed this to their landlord's failure to make repairs. So they said that that rendered their units unlivable and dangerous, and so they were forced to move because of that. It's sometimes referred to as a constructive eviction in a legal context. But others had told tales, sometimes quite harrowing, of their landlord refusing, for instance, to accept rental assistance during the pandemic that would have kept them housed. Landlords filing repeat cases against them, often without any cause. Landlords engaging in discriminatory or clear harassment behaviors. And then also landlords who enacted really large rent increases that they couldn't maintain. So next, we saw that tenants with eviction records, when they tried to find future housing, encountered commonly landlord screening practices that prevented them from accessing housing and prolonged the housing instability period that they were in. So 8 in 10 said that their eviction filing limited their future housing options. 65% of those who moved said that a prospective landlord asked about their eviction record, and about half reported that a landlord explicitly denied their application because of their filing. And many more also said that they would often not get a call back, so they wouldn't actually know. So this is among people just who knew. And then they also said that unsuccessful rental applications ended up amounting to hundreds of, or in some cases, thousands of dollars of excess costs because they couldn't find a place and had to submit often rental application fees over and over again. You can go on. So I want to quickly highlight a vignette of a participant who we call Charla, whose situation is really emblematic of these trends. So Charla is a single mom who has 3 kids, and the conditions in her home were quite dangerous. So there was leaking, there was holes in the floor that their landlord refused to fix. And eventually this led to the ceiling in one of her daughter's rooms to collapse. And so after that happened, she said, enough, I'm escrowing or withholding her rent, which is legal under Pennsylvania law. She also called the health department, who got involved. And then shortly after she withheld her rent, her landlord filed an eviction case against her for non-payment. And even though Charlotte got legal assistance and she was able to actually win her case, her family still had to remain in unsafe conditions as she searched for new housing, which took a long time. She thinks she applied to about 50 different places and paid about $2,000 in rental application fees. And we have her quoted here saying, when I go to find new housing, we can't because we have these filings on our records, and that's wrong. I won my case. I won a few cases because she had multiple filings. Why is it still following me? And we also have Charlotte going on to say, well, the system failed us. Landlords put us in situations where we have to move because they don't want to make repairs. And then they take us to court and try to make it seem like it's our fault. And this was a common sentiment shared among participants. Kate?
Thank you. So as Lex discussed, 2/3 of our participants had moved from their housing despite those quote unquote positive court outcomes. And so some of these tenants with eviction records ended up moving into substandard or hazardous units in order to either avoid homelessness or emerge from homelessness. In fact, 47% of participants who moved after their filing described a subsequent period of homelessness. So this could look a lot of different ways. This included folks living in their cars, in shelters, doubled up with friends and family. And these periods of time could last anywhere between a few weeks to over a year in some instances. And at the time of data collection, 10% of our participants who had moved still lacked a place to stay reliably. And so we define that as 7 nights a week consecutively for the next 30 days. And so as a last resort to homelessness, participants described the need to accept poor housing conditions. So they found themselves at the bottom of the housing market, even though a lot of them were actually increasing their rental costs. So 75% of this group had unaffordable rent burdens, and 1/3 of them described their housing as either unstable or unhealthy. One participant described how anything is like a palace compared to homelessness, and others described, as I have here on the slide, looking for a slumlord or just doing what she had to do to survive. And so these participants who moved found themselves stuck in this cycle of persistent housing instability. So 1/3 had experienced a subsequent eviction threat. So that could look like a verbal warning or a formal notice since they relocated to their new housing. And so tenants who stayed in their housing had some different experiences, but also some similar experiences to those who moved. Some people might assume that those who stayed in their housing after their eviction filing were better off. And in some ways that might be true. These folks avoided displacement, they avoided moving costs and expensive time-consuming housing searches. But tenants who stayed in their housing often also lived in unstable or unhealthy conditions, and they often attributed this to a lack of affordable alternatives in their neighborhoods. And so nearly half of this group endorsed that same statement that their housing was either unstable or unhealthy. And so court involvement for some of our participants helped them to secure long-awaited repairs. So maybe their landlord just needed the kind of court involvement to trigger those repairs. But others were left in the same poor conditions. So they had leaking roofs, mold, pests once the eviction filing was resolved. And 2/3 of them had faced another eviction threat since their filing. And so many of them were living in a chronic state of worry and just fearful that they would receive another eviction filing. I have this quote here on my slide: "Once there's an emergency, you're always going to feel that looming over you." And so all of these tenants who stayed in their housing said that they would move to a better housing situation if they could. But the challenge there is that nearly all of them were currently receiving a rental subsidy or residing in public housing. And so they had kind of a good gig going. They could keep up with that rent and wanted to remain in place, but had these other kind of disputes going on with their landlords in terms of repairs often. And so 2/3 of them had lived in their homes for 6 years or more. And so that's kind of what was keeping them. They didn't want to give up this rare opportunity for affordable housing. And so they were staying in place. And so I'll share a vignette here in a moment that illustrates these challenges that folks who stayed often faced. So this participant, we call her Linda in the report, is a single mom living with her 2 kids. And like many of those who stayed in their housing, she's lived at the same property for many years. She receives a rental subsidy. And a dispute over repairs precipitated her eviction filing. She requested some necessary repairs, which her landlord agreed to make. And he passed those costs down to her. And she unknowingly accumulated a balance of just $300 and had an eviction filed against her without ever knowing that she had that balance. And so Linda was most concerned about keeping her kids housed. And so she prepared to fight her eviction. She went to court ready to raise defenses. And her landlord failed to appear and later withdrew the case. And so Linda and her kids remain in their housing. They're hoping to save up and move somewhere better. But in the meantime, she feels stuck in these poor conditions and fearful that the filing that's now on her record would limit her in the future. In this quote here at the top, "Why does the filing stick if the landlord doesn't follow the process?" really captures the injustice of Linda's case. And finally, we found that after their filings, tenants are often less willing to assert their right to habitable housing. And so this was most acute among participants who had been on the receiving end of a retaliatory filing in the past. And so, yeah, 43% of participants were less willing. And so multiple tenants in need of major health and safety repairs refrain from making requests, trying to avoid the threat of eviction or just to avoid conflict with their landlord. And this was true for folks who moved and for folks who stayed. In this quote here, "I'm afraid they'll look at it as if I damaged it and then have more reasons to get rid of me." And I should also note that other participants were just as willing, or more willing even, to ask for the repairs that they needed in their units. They felt empowered with information about their rights, or had simply lost their patience for landlords who couldn't provide them with their basic needs. Next.
Yeah, so landlord filing and screening practices are exacerbating the effects of the housing crisis in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, and making it, in the case of participants in our study, nearly impossible for tenants with eviction records to find safe, decent, or affordable housing for their families. So what in the world can we do about this? We put forward 3 recommendations in our report. You can read more about them there, but today we're going to focus on the potential specifically for eviction record sealing laws to mitigate the lasting harms of eviction records. So I want to start by saying first that because evictions in the US are disproportionately filed against Black and Latino women and their children, tenant screening practices that blacklist applicants based on eviction records perpetuate housing discrimination. So this is a clear, fair housing and racial justice issue that we need to care about and do something about immediately. And the good news is that it doesn't need to be like this. Eviction records do not need to haunt tenants indefinitely. This is because lawmakers can pass legislation that automatically seals eviction records at the point of filing so that they never enter the public record unless the court decides to unseal them for a reason. And then eviction sealing can also work retroactively. So it can hide records after a specified time period or once certain court criteria are met, like a judgment being satisfied or set aside. Now, 12 states have moved to limit public access to eviction records or to regulate landlord-tenant screening. And relevant to our discussion today, Pennsylvania policymakers are currently considering legislation to seal eviction records. Critical to our discussion in Michigan is that there is currently an effort underway here to seal eviction records at the state level. And so, it's not a magic bullet. These policies will not solve our housing crisis, not even close. But they can stop the harm of the lasting harm that we observed in our report, kind of similar to how clean slate legislation that has been enacted in Pennsylvania for people with criminal records. Eviction record sealing can remove unjust barriers for people with eviction records and open up more housing opportunities for folks. And this is a first step towards accessing safe and stable housing that all people deserve.
All right, so I just want to provide a QR code if folks want to explore the report in greater detail or read some more of those vignettes. I think Caitlin will also pop that link in the chat again. Thank you again to CLS as well as Poverty Solutions for supporting this work, and to Malika and Rashanik for having us. And I will pass things back to Holly to introduce our next speaker.
Much to Lex and Kate for sharing all of the thought and care that went into this study. Again, if folks have questions for Lex and Kate, please put them in the questions chat, and the hosts are collecting questions to be answered in a few minutes. I now have the pleasure of introducing Pennsylvania State Representative Ismail Smith-Waddell. Prior to his election to the Pennsylvania Legislature, Rep. Smith-Waddell, or as he likes to be called, Izzy, was the president of Lancaster City Council, where he'd served since 2017. During his 4 years on council, Izzy helped secure the largest investments in affordable housing and lead removal for the city of Lancaster in its history. He would champion the decriminalization of cannabis, a completely revamped use of force policy for police officers, and increased police accountability in response to community requests. Izzy was born and raised in Lancaster. After graduating from Carnegie Mellon University, Izzy returned to his hometown and began working in Lancaster's nonprofit sector to deliver relief to vulnerable people, first in behavioral health and drug and alcohol rehabilitation, then as a grant writer and researcher. As a program specialist at Lancaster County Homeless Coalition, he coordinated services and support for Lancaster County's housing insecure community. Prior to his tenure as a state representative, Izzy launched Refresh Lancaster, a mobile hygiene unit which delivered showers, social services, and medical attention to homeless Lancastrians. Did I get that right? Lancastrians? Izzy has fought for grassroots change in his community as the vice chair of the Lancaster County Democratic Party and as a community organizer with striking Kellogg's workers for fair wages and benefits, and Pennsylvania's educators to demand fair funding for public schools. He's raised his voice to protect abortion access, defend Black lives, welcome immigrants and refugees, and denounce anti-Semitism. Izzy is the first Black and first queer state representative from Lancaster. His inspiration for his life and work as a public servant is the example of his mother, Rita Smith-Waddell, who was a professor at Millersville University, a union member, community organizer, and single mom. His mom always made a point of helping others, even when she had little for herself. She taught Izzy that when you have something to give, you give it, and if you don't have it to give, you go get more to give. Izzy has come to Harrisburg to partner with like-minded legislators to correct the Commonwealth's laws that favor giant corporations, lobbyists, and a status quo that hurts working families. Those laws prevent the leveling of the playing field for friends and neighbors. He will advocate for legislation that puts power to the shared values of kindness, welcome, dignity, and care. Thank you for being here, Rep. Izzy. You have the floor.
I was not anticipating you to read the whole bio, but thank you so much. And Holly, you've been an incredible partner in this work, so thank you to you. I really want to spend my time talking about why eviction sealing is so important for the people of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and what that's looked like in my legislative district. Now, I think the data really speaks for itself, both in terms of the impact that evictions have on the lives of everyday people, particularly Black and Brown people, particularly parents with children, and indeed sort of the excesses of the system as we've described, that double filings or filings based on nothing at all, or filings where a judge finds in favor of the tenant can still hold a tenant back. So I first got engaged with eviction sealing as a concept in my last year on Lancaster City Council. I met a woman named Alicia. Alicia is a mother of four. She's Latina. She was living downtown in what can only be described as a slumlord's apartment. So she called me and she asked me to come look at her apartment and see what the state of it was. And so I did. And there were a number of really appalling health code violations, including the really frequent presence of black mold in her kitchen and in her bathroom. So, really thinking I was doing the right thing. We live in a city with code enforcement, housing code enforcement. Not every city in Pennsylvania has that. So the inspectors came through, they issued a violation to the landlord. Now, within a week, Alicia had a notice to quit on her front door. Um, and her landlord filed an eviction against her. That summer, Alicia spent the whole summer trying to find housing for her and her children. She ended up applying to about 31 different apartments. About 12 of them ever even gave her a response, and each of them mentioned a previous eviction. And that eviction had occurred 4 years prior. That's 6.5 years ago now. But 4 years prior, she was evicted from a previous apartment while while unable to represent herself in court because she had fled to another city because, frankly, her boyfriend, who is now incarcerated, was abusive to her and to her children. Now, in the records that landlords are pulling, there's not documentation of domestic violence. She can't go back and add that to the court records if a landlord would even look that closely at an application. And so what had happened was the way that she put it to me, and this will always stay with me, was that 4 years prior, an abusive man had made her homeless, and now he was making her homeless again. She ended up spending about a year and a half in shelter with her kids before finding a place to live, kind of having been followed by this previous eviction where she was frankly clearly not at fault. And this is generally the case. The most common household that is evicted is a female householder of color with multiple children, and the most common kind of person evicted in the Commonwealth and across the country is a child being directly impacted by eviction. So when I arrived in the legislature, I was really overjoyed to find that community legal services and some of my colleagues in the state house were already in this work. And so partnering with CLS and other colleagues, we drafted a piece of legislation, HB 1769, the Ready to Rent Act, which takes a new approach or a new approach for the Pennsylvania legislature on eviction ceiling. The gold standard version of our bill does I think four things, and Holly's going to correct me if I miss one of them. I'm the pretty face, Holly's the smart one. So the first thing that the bill does is it seals those records on adjudication. So if a landlord takes a tenant to court and that tenant, pardon me, and the judge finds in favor of the tenant or the case is withdrawn or dismissed, um, then that record would automatically be made, limited access. The public cannot see it broadly. And I'll talk in a second about why that's important. The second thing, and I think this is a real thing for people, so much of our civil and criminal legal system is based around the idea of accountability, but our current system actually discourages it. What do I mean? As it stands right now, there's no automatic process by which a tenant can satisfy their judgment, pay back the money owed, and have the eviction removed from their record. The bill that we've drafted with CLS provides for the sealing of eviction records on the satisfaction of judgment and provides for the sealing of all eviction records after 7 years. And that's about in line with the amount of time it takes bankruptcy to fall off of your credit report. So the bill does those three things and provides penalties against the illegal distribution of those records. And I feel like I've gone out of order, but here's the issue. Um, in a oh, my staff. Eviction records used to be maintained by the consumer credit reporting agencies, the CPFB, the Consumer Protection Financial Bureau, I got that backwards, sorry, the CFPB, ended up telling those agencies that they could not. And so a variety of companies popped up. Holly always says like mushrooms after rain. They popped up, and what they do is they buy data in batches from our local courts and they sell them to background check companies. And often that data is like a date, a name, and that it is a landlord-tenant filing. It contains none of the important information about the case. Look, I know I am myself a landlord. I know what the background check comes back looking like. And it won't tell you if it was a non-payment eviction or another lease violation. It won't tell you if it was over $5, $50, $500, $5,000. It won't tell you, as in Alicia's case, if there was domestic violence, which an affirmative defense in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and it won't even tell you if the tenant beat the case, which is to say there are thousands of people, households in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania being denied housing over evictions that never actually happened. And that's I think the thing that I want to drill in is that our bill is designed to protect tenants from the realities of the landlord-tenant system and the housing crisis, but also from what are essentially legal falsehoods which haunt people for decades. So, um, status update on our piece of legislation. HB 1769, eviction sealing got its first committee vote in September of this year. Has had one of the three necessary readings that it would need to get a vote out of the House, and thank you. And we're working with internal and external stakeholders to make sure that we do get a passage out of the House and out of the Senate. Now, we're coming up on the end of session this year here on November 30th, but we're excited to reintroduce this bill in the next session. And we have support from a broad-based group of stakeholders, including the Pennsylvania Realtors Association, Organized Labor, the Philadelphia Federation of Teachers. We feel pretty good about our ability to build a movement that is going to pass this bill and provide protection for thousands of tenants. I think that's my time.
Thank you so much, Rep. Izzy. We now have some time for questions, although I will acknowledge far less than we could take up. So I will do my best to allocate and direct this Q&A as efficiently as possible. But as a moderator, I get to ask the first question. And so, Lex and Kate, I want to ask you if you if you could, talk to yourselves before starting this study, what surprised you in this process? What defied your expectations?
Yeah, I can kick us off. So we set out to study the impact of eviction filings alone, but pretty quickly realized that it's not entirely that simple. As Rep. Izzy was talking about, court records don't necessarily reflect post-filing realities. So they don't capture whether folks were displaced or not primarily. And so we quickly realized that displacement is a part of the picture and part of what we were also capturing in our data about folks' filing experiences. And also something that Rep. Izzy alluded to, tenants' lives, especially low-income tenants' lives, are not that simple. You might have really competing social and economic forces undermining people's well-being and stability, things like intimate partner violence, things like job loss, disability, that interrupt folks' lives at the same time as an eviction filing. So some complicating factors, maybe, Holly.
Is there anything you want to add to that, Lex?
No, I think that covers it pretty well.
All right, well, thank you. Rep. Izzy, I want to turn to you. I'm going to ask this question, then I'm going to combine it with one that was in the chat. Pennsylvania is a pretty geographically diverse state. And as we've learned in this legislative effort, the court systems are not necessarily all centrally connected. So what makes you confident that eviction sealing is doable in Pennsylvania? And I will add to that, someone asked in the chat, how do appeals work their way into the eviction sealing framework?
That's a great question. And the second question is one actually that Holly and I have spent a lot of time trying to work out exactly what that's going to look like. So first and foremost, the reason I'm confident that eviction sealing is doable in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is that, frankly, we make the laws. All of the things that we want to do are possible. And I start with that because I've gotten some, we've gotten some pushbacks from various stakeholders. Oh, okay, our existing court system doesn't work like this. We don't have a statewide unified civil legal record system. And so two things on that. One, we can make one. And then second, again, because Holly's really the brain trust here, we've worked with the Administrative Office of Pennsylvania Courts to develop a framework that works in the meantime, that would provide for, pardon me, records which would be sealed to be disposed and then passed up to the prothonotary who manage these things at the appeals court level for sealing, reopening in the instance of, pardon me, in the instance of a landlord appeal, and then sealing again on final adjudication. One of the big problems that we have, pardon me, in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and it creates problems not just for eviction sealing, is our lack of investment in judicial data systems. Part of making this work is making sure that the people who administer our courts have the funding that they need. And I would fall back to kind of a catchphrase that I always use, and you've certainly heard before, that a budget is a moral document. We need to invest more in our court system, but the partnership with AOPC and other stakeholders makes me feel confident that pardon me, that it's doable even before we reinvent the wheel here in the Commonwealth.
Thank you, Rep. Izzy. I will take one quick question on the chat because I know the answer. What's the difference between sealing and expungement? Real quick, expungement means erasing the record. It's as if it never existed. No one can see it. It just isn't there anymore. That's what expungement is. Sealing isn't erasing the record. It's putting a mask over it. And so, in the context, I believe it was Lex who brought up Clean Slate, Pennsylvania's innovative automatic criminal record sealing. Most of that is sealing. That is, the record is sealed, the public can't access it, but certain members of court staff can, certain law enforcement offices can. So that's what sealing is. I now want to go back to All right, Lex and Kate, one question from the chat. If you happen to have this information, you certainly referred to the other jurisdictions that are working on this issue. But what are the additional states that have already worked to seal eviction records? And apologies for putting you in the hot seat if you don't have that right in front of you, but someone did ask.
Yeah, that was Dr. Linda Chanders. Thanks for that question. I sent a link that actually PolicyLink, who has put out incredible research on the same topic, is mapping and tracking these policies as they come up. But it's important to look closely at all of the policies individually. It's kind of hard. It's hard to do that kind of policy surveillance work that they're doing. So we rely and look to them. And I think maybe Kate looked like they were maybe dropping something in a chat or.
I'm not gonna drop anything in the chat, but I will say policies like these vary quite a bit. Lex and I tend to highlight California, Colorado, and Oregon. But more and more the proposals are popping off across the country. I meant to say popping up, but popping off also. And yeah, so I'll leave that there.
All right, we've got 2 minutes. Lex and Kate, where can people find your work if they want to follow you and aren't already?
Yes, you can sign up for the Housing Solutions for Health Equity newsletter to keep up to date with what our initiative is doing. Lex is a frequent collaborator of us. You can also hear anything they have going on there too.
And Rep. Izzy, real quick, what does the road ahead for eviction sealing look like as of today in Pennsylvania?
I think right now we have a strong team of stakeholders, and now we have some legislative progress underneath our feet. I feel confident about getting passage out of the House, and so in the next session, it will be about engaging with state senators once we get passage out of the House in the following session. And that's, I got to tell you, we're seeing a growing amount of bipartisan support for the proposal. Everybody needs a safe place to call home, and legislators of both parties recognize that.
On that note, thank you all so much. I'm going to hand it back to Roshanik.
I would like to thank our speakers today, and especially Holly for moderating this wonderful, informative session. And I'd also like to thank our viewers for joining us today. Some links have been posted for ways that you can stay connected with us. And please be sure to join our newsletter to stay informed about our upcoming events throughout the year. As always, thank you to our team and looking forward to our next session. Thank you again, speakers. Take care.